This is a quick video about reinforcements. So your reinforcements appear on your charts over here, your turn records. You can see your reinforcements, which are the commander's names, are their entry hexes. Okay, now when they come on, they will come on at the entry hex, but they get one free move at the start. Now the reinforcements arrive at the start of the movement phase and they get a free move. So Pajot here actually arrived at this hex and he was able to use the movement. Remember, you use the movement of the combat unit, which is on the organisational track. So if you look at Pajot, he's a bit of an oddity. He hasn't actually got a track, but so he's got a cavalry unit with him with a strength of 3, movement of 7, and a sort of command level of half. So we move 7. Okay, what we will do is you get your charts. Go and have a look at your charts. So he's going to be moving along primary roads. So if you look at that, the cost for infantry and cavalry is 0.5. So effectively he can move 1. Well, he's on secondary roads where he first starts. So that's 1, 2, 3. Then he goes 4 into that, and then 5, 6, 7. Okay. And then what you do then is, I'll just put a counter on there just to say that he's moved, because you can't move again during the movement phase, because what happens from now on, you're going to be either using administrative points to generate commands to move things, or you're going to be rolling for initiative. Okay, while we're on doing little videos and things, we might as well do zones of control. Alright, the zone of control is the hex occupied by the force. So force is anything where there's a leader basically and there's some combat units underneath. So a unit where there's just a leader on its own, that doesn't count as a force. So Napoleon there, he hasn't got any troops with him. There's a special term for that and I forget what it is off the top of my head. I can't find it. Okay, so it's the 6 hexes immediately surrounding it as well. All forces exert a zone of control at all times. A hex in the zone of control of a force is referred to as a controlled hex. Adjacent opposing forces are equally and mutually affected by each other's zones of control. There's no additional effects if a hex is controlled by more than one enemy force. Any force in an enemy control zone at the beginning of the friendly battle resolution segment of the combat phase must attack an adjacent enemy force unless some other friendly force attacks that enemy force. Terrain influence on zones of control. Terrain affects the extent of control exerted by a force. In some situations, a zone of control extends out of but not into a fortified town. Combat and counterattack are not mandatory for a force inside a fortified town and citadel, regardless of the size of the enemy force that may be adjacent to it and in its zone of control. Zone of controls do not extend across a non-bridge primary river hex side. Zone of control extending across a bridge primary river hex side is modified in that the combat is not mandatory between the two forces across the bridge. Exiting and entering zone of controls. Upon entering an enemy zone of control, a force must cease movement. Exceptions: a pursuing force may ignore enemy zones of control in the first hex of a path of retreat, and the retreating force may move through enemy zones of control. Initiative for axing a force in an enemy zone of control at the beginning of a command phase may attempt to move out, but only move by initiative. The initiative rating of the force leader is modified by the resistance modifier, which we'll go into later. Extra costs for exiting enemy zone of control. A force may never move directly from one enemy zone of control to another, except in the first hex of a pursuit or during a retreat. To exit an enemy zone of control costs 2 movement points in addition to any terrain costs of the hex nearly entered. If the exiting force is cavalry only and the force exerting the zone has no cavalry, or any force leaves an enemy of 1 strength point, it pays no additional movements to exit. If 2 strength points, it's +1 exit. There is no extra cost to enter enemy zones of control. Okay, we'll have a quick chat about forces, since we've got on to forces. I've already mentioned a force consists of at least 1 leader on the map and at least 1 combat unit on that leader's track on the organisational display. More than 1 leader may be in a force, but must be subordinate to the force leader. The size of the force is limited by the command span of the force leader. The size of a force is limited by the commands. Sorry, we already said that. But it may never be more than 48 strength points for movement and stacking. If more than 1 leader is in a force and the leaders occupy the same hex, combat units may be transferred between the leader tracks. Insubordinate stacks, where 2 or 4 leaders are trying to occupy the same hex and there's no leader present with a command span equal adequate to command all of the units in a single force. A force or forces are displaced 1 hex at the moment in which they're present would create an insubordinate stack. Right, so an insubordinate stack is basically a stack where you haven't got a leader capable of commanding all the units in the hex, so you're going to have to displace one of those forces out of that hex to resolve that. Multi-force hexes. 2 forces may occupy the same hex under the following circumstances. 2 forces are moved into the same hex for the purpose of combining into a single one. During the command phase, subordinate leaders may be removed from the force leader's track on the organisational place and placed on the game map. The instant these leaders are on the game map, they constitute new forces and are no longer subordinate to the force leader. In subsequent movement phase, one force or the other must vacate the hex, either through movement, commands, or initiative procedure. If this fails, you have to displace one of the forces. You can also do multi-force hex if an adjacent leader can command both forces. So it's a creation of force during movement. A force is defined during the combat phase. Subordinate leaders placed on the map during the command phase constitute separate forces. No new force leaders may be placed on the map after the end of the command phase. Exception: subordinate leaders may be dropped off at any time during movement, force, march or pursuit in any hex passed through by the force leader. This must be done, however, the instant the force leader passes through the hex. To do so, simply remove the subordinate leader from the organisation or display it in place on the map. This new force may not continue moving and must remain in the drop-off hex for the rest of the phase or segment. The force must stop moving when any unit in that force runs out of MPs unless it's dropped off. Thus a force leader can march with a mixed force of infantry and cavalry, drop off a subordinate leader with the infantry, and continue moving or pursuing with the cavalry. A force being dropped off still determines its attrition with the rest of that force, and the number of strength points is the number that started the movement with a force leader. Creation of a force during combat. The attacking player only defines a force at the instant of combat. Thus he could move several forces adjacent to the enemy and reconstitute them as one multi-hex force under a single leader if that leader has a command span capable of subordinating all the others into one force. For purposes of movement and combat, a leader may command other leaders in adjacent hexes. Any leader may combine the force in his hex with the forces in adjacent hex so long as the leader has a command span sufficient to subordinate the other leaders. The forces remain adjacent and may move under the force leader's initiative or at the expense of a single movement command, and they may attack together. Maximum size of a multi-hex force of movement and stacking but not combat is 48 strength points. Removing losses from combat units. Distribute losses in strength points suffered by a force throughout the combat units and in the force as evenly as possible, so that at the end of the last round of combat all units have taken as even losses as possible. There are exceptions for old guard and artillery, but we'll cover that some other time.